Hello everyone, my name is Morris Patrick. Today I want to discuss 4 important sources about America's child welfare system. As I discuss each source, I will show a screenshot on the screen so you can see exactly what I am talking about. I am not asking you to simply believe what I say. I want you to read these sources, research the information yourself, and understand how the different parts of the child welfare system connect. The title is The Flawed Nature and Impacts of the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA. Let's begin with CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. This research explains that CAPTA helped establish the infrastructure and policies behind CPS, including mandated reporting and federal support for research, training, and treatment programs. One of the most important issues raised in this research is the difference between actual neglect and circumstances caused by poverty. Families may struggle with unemployment, lack of childcare, food insecurity, domestic violence, inadequate housing, under-resourced neighborhoods, and other hardships. The research explains that these circumstances can affect how parents are reported, investigated, and judged, even when structural conditions outside of the parent's control are involved. This distinction is extremely important because a parent who intentionally refuses to provide for a child is not necessarily in the same situation as a parent who wants to provide, but does not have enough money, transportation, childcare, housing, or community support. If those circumstances are treated the same way, families who need assistance can instead find themselves under government investigation. The study provides examples from mothers who experience CPS investigations. One mother said she was caring for triplets, experiencing abuse and did not have much family support. She said she contacted CPS herself because she needed assistance, but according to her account, her triplet sons were subsequently removed for approximately a year. Years later, she experienced another CPS intervention involving all 4 of her children, who she said were eventually returned to her. Another example involved a mother whose children's school absences occurred while she was dealing with medical problems and transportation difficulties. The research describes alternatives that might have helped the family, including working with counselors and providing practical support, rather than immediately approaching the situation as educational neglect. The conclusion of this research is especially important. The authors argue that economic hardship and help-seeking can become interpreted as neglect and lead to investigation rather than assistance. They call for child welfare policy to separate poverty from neglect and to prioritize material and relational support over surveillance. This should make Americans think carefully about what child protection means. Protecting children from genuine abuse is necessary, but protecting children can also mean helping a safe parent obtain the resources necessary to care for them. The title is Good Intentions, Harmful Consequences, the Reality of Mandated Reporting. The second source examines mandated reporting, which is another major part of America's child welfare system. Teachers, doctors, social workers, and other designated professionals can be legally required to report suspected child abuse or neglect. Children's Rights explains that federal law connects funding to state reporting systems, while states determine who must report, what circumstances require reporting, and what happens afterward. The numbers deserve public attention. According to Children's Rights, CPS agencies nationwide received approximately 4.365 million referrals involving 7.7 million children, while only about 7% of those children were later identified as victims of abuse or neglect. Children's Rights argues that overreporting can strain CPS agencies and make it harder for them to concentrate on children who are actually in danger. This does not mean that every report that does not result in a maltreatment finding was intentionally false. A teacher, doctor, neighbor, or another person may have a genuine concern about a child and report it in good faith. However, the enormous difference between the number of children referred and the number ultimately identified as victims deserves serious examination. Children's Rights also discusses how poverty can enter this process. The organization points to inadequate housing, lack of childcare, food insecurity, and unmet medical needs as circumstances that can trigger CPS involvement under broad definitions of neglect. It also argues that mandated reporters can have strong incentives to report when they are uncertain, because they can face consequences for failing to report suspected maltreatment, while receiving protections for good faith reports. There is another consequence that should concern everyone. Children's Rights says overreporting may cause families to disengage from doctors, teachers, mental health professionals, and other people who could otherwise help them. When families become afraid that asking for assistance could lead to an investigation, trust between families and helping institutions can break down. The CAPTA research raises a similar concern, describing parents who may avoid mandated reporters because they fear CPS surveillance and possible child removal. This creates an important public policy problem because a child protection system should encourage families to seek help early, not make safe families afraid that asking for help could put them under investigation. The title is Child Welfare. Better data and guidance could help states reinvest adoption savings and improve federal oversight. The third source comes from the United States Government Accountability Office and examines something many taxpayers probably have never heard about: adoption savings. Federal legislation expanded eligibility for federal adoption assistance. As the federal government assumed more of these costs, states saved money they otherwise would have spent. Federal law requires states to reinvest those savings into child welfare services. According to GAO, states accumulated approximately $843 million in adoption savings during the period it examined, and reinvested approximately $516 million. GAO found that approximately $224 million was spent on post-adoption or post-guardianship services, approximately $67 million went toward preventive services for youth at risk of entering foster care, and approximately $225 million went toward other child welfare services. The amount states reinvested varied significantly. 10 states spent all of their accumulated adoption savings, while 23 spent less than half, including 9 that spent none during the period examined. GAO also identified problems involving oversight. The Children's Bureau monitors state reinvestment of adoption savings, but GAO found that limitations in the available data made oversight more difficult. GAO also noted that there was no statutory deadline requiring states to spend accumulated savings, meaning states could delay spending. I want to make an important distinction here. This GAO report does not establish that CPS removes children in order to make money. We should not turn evidence about child welfare financing into a claim that the evidence itself does not prove. What this report does show is that America's child welfare system includes complicated federal and state financial structures involving adoption assistance and required reinvestment into child welfare services. That deserves taxpayer attention. Americans should understand how much money enters these systems, how it is distributed, how much reaches prevention programs, how much supports families before foster care becomes necessary, and whether government oversight is strong enough to make sure the money actually benefits children as Congress intended. The title is Evolving Roles of Public and Private Agencies in Privatized Child Welfare Systems. This source reveals something that I believe every parent and taxpayer should understand about the child welfare system. When people hear the word CPS, they may assume that every important decision involving a family is being handled directly by government employees. This report shows that the reality can be much more complicated. The report explains that child welfare privatization can involve transferring case management responsibilities from public agencies to private contractors. Under the definition used in this report, private contractors can make day-to-day decisions concerning a child and family's case, although those decisions generally remain subject to public agency and court review or approval. This is not just about hiring a private company to provide counseling or transportation. The report describes jurisdictions where private providers assumed some or all core case management functions, while other systems divided responsibilities between government and private agencies. In some arrangements, private agencies had near total control over certain decisions involving services and placements. That is a powerful distinction because these decisions can directly affect the future of a family. The report examined who assesses children and families, who determines services and placement levels, who participates in visitation and reunification decisions, who makes recommendations concerning termination of parental rights, and who presents case plans in dependency court. Think about what that means. A private organization operating under a government contract may not merely provide a service after CPS makes a decision. Depending on the jurisdiction and contract, private workers can participate directly in the case management process that helps shape what happens to a child and parent. The report found that in 6 of the 7 jurisdictions examined, private providers had primary case management authority to determine the level of placement, subject to public agency or court review in certain circumstances. Even more serious is what the report says about termination of parental rights. The court ultimately makes the legal decision to terminate parental rights, but private agencies can play a role in recommending that outcome. The report states that in Florida's Circuit 10 and Milwaukee, private agency workers put forward termination recommendations to courts with limited public agency involvement. Private workers could also appear directly in court. In the 7 jurisdictions examined, private agency caseworkers presented case plans at hearings following the initial detention or protective custody hearing, although the precise involvement of public workers differed among jurisdictions. Now follow another part of this report carefully: financial incentives. The report explains that child welfare privatization expanded during the 1990s partly through efforts to downsize government, improve service quality, and contain costs. It also describes contracts linking payments to performance, and says that financial incentives and disincentives were intended to influence provider practices and results. That does not prove that private agencies remove children or recommend termination of parental rights for financial gain. The report does not establish that, and we should not claim it does. But the combination should make the public pay attention. We are talking about a system where government contracts, private organizations, financial incentives, case management authority, placement decisions, court recommendations, and decisions affecting the permanent relationship between parents and children can exist within the same child welfare structure. That is why accountability matters. When government delegates important responsibilities involving children to private organizations, the public deserves to know exactly who is making each decision, who is paying them, what the contract rewards, what the contract penalizes, who reviews their work, what happens when they make mistakes, and whether families have a meaningful way to challenge those decisions. The report itself shows why oversight matters. It explains that even in a fully privatized arrangement, the public agency retains ultimate authority through oversight, performance standards, contract monitoring, and quality assurance. So when someone says CPS made the decision, that may not tell us the entire story. We should be asking, which public agency, which private contractor, who performed the assessment, who selected the services, who recommended the placement, who developed the case plan, who made the recommendation presented to the judge, and who was responsible for making sure all of those decisions were accurate. That is the powerful lesson from this source. Child welfare can be a public-private system, and when the government gives private organizations responsibilities capable of changing a child's and parents' lives forever, transparency should not be optional. Parents deserve accountability, children deserve accountability, and taxpayers who fund the system deserve to know who is actually making decisions behind the words Child Protective Services. The title is putting the 4 sources together: America Wake UP. Americans, it is time to wake up and understand how large the child welfare system really is. Do not wait until CPS knocks on your door or someone you love becomes involved in the system before you start asking questions. These issues affect children, parents, families, taxpayers, and communities across this country. When we put these 4 sources together, we see something much bigger than one CPS social worker. We see federal laws influencing child welfare policy. We see mandated reporting bringing millions of children to the attention of CPS. We see government funding flowing through adoption assistance and other child welfare programs. We see private organizations receiving government contracts and, in some jurisdictions, participating in important case management decisions affecting children and parents. The first source warns us about something Americans cannot afford to ignore. Poverty and hardship should not automatically be confused with child neglect. A family struggling with food, housing, childcare, transportation, domestic violence, or other limited resources may need assistance rather than punishment. The CAPTA research argues for separating poverty from neglect and prioritizing material and relational support over surveillance. The second source forces us to look closely at mandated reporting. Reporting suspected abuse can save a child's life when genuine danger exists, but a system that generates millions of referrals also requires safeguards against unnecessary intervention. Americans should care about whether families become afraid to speak openly with teachers, doctors, therapists, and other professionals because asking for help could lead to CPS involvement. The third source tells taxpayers to pay attention to the money. There are federal and state financial structures involving adoption assistance, adoption savings, prevention programs, and other child welfare services. This does not prove that CPS removes children for money, and we should not make a claim the evidence does not establish. But it absolutely gives Americans a reason to demand transparency, oversight, and proof that public money is actually improving outcomes for children and families. Then Source 4 should get everyone's attention. The child welfare system can include private contractors, not only government employees. Depending on the jurisdiction, private organizations can participate in case management involving services, placement, visitation, reunification, court case plans, and even recommendations concerning termination of parental rights. The judge ultimately makes the legal decision on termination, but private organizations can still participate in the process leading to that decision. America, think about what that means. When someone simply says CPS made the decision, that may not explain every person or organization involved. Parents and taxpayers should know who investigated the allegations, who evaluated the family, who selected services, who recommended placement, who prepared the case plan, who made recommendations to the court, who received government money, and who was responsible for checking whether those decisions were accurate. This is why Americans cannot afford to ignore child welfare policy simply because they do not currently have a CPS case. You pay taxes that support government systems. You elect lawmakers who write the laws. Those laws create authority that can affect families. That means you have every reason to understand how the system operates and demand accountability from the people responsible for it. Wake up and research these laws. Read government reports instead of relying only on social media. Follow the public money. Examine government contracts. Ask who has decision-making authority. Ask what oversight exists. Ask your representatives what they are doing to distinguish poverty from neglect, strengthen prevention services, protect children from genuine abuse, and prevent unnecessary family separation. This is not a call to ignore child abuse. Real child abuse must be investigated, and children who are genuinely in danger must be protected. But government power over families must also come with evidence, due process, transparency, meaningful oversight, and accountability. The tilt is 5 questions Americans need to ask. 1. Are poverty and lack of resources being properly distinguished from actual abuse and neglect? 2. When does mandated reporting protect children, and when can it result in unnecessary surveillance of families? 3. Where does America's child welfare money go, and how much reaches families before children enter foster care? 4. When private contractors participate in decisions affecting families, who monitors them and holds them accountable? 5. Before separating a child from a parent, is enough being done to determine whether practical assistance could safely keep that family together? America, wake up! Don't wait until this system reaches your family before you decide to understand it. Read the 4 sources, follow the evidence, follow the money, ask questions, contact your lawmakers, demand transparency and accountability. Protect children from real abuse. Help struggling families before they collapse, hold public and private agencies accountable, and make sure the enormous power of the child welfare system is exercised with evidence, fairness, and respect for families.